Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me. First of all, I'm very excited to be here. For the last 10 years, a very long time, I've focused on the related issues of media manipulation, the spread of mis and disinformation across social media, and the ethics of journalistic amplification. Sometimes these discussions have been one element of a larger research project, like my work studying subcultural trolls. That's my book. Sometimes they have been central to a project, like my recent Data and Society report, The Oxygen of Amplification. At other times, media manipulation, the spread of mis and disinformation across social media, and the ethics of journalistic amplification have come up when I've been interviewed by reporters for stories about online hate and harassment, political memes, and other forms of ambivalent online communication, and coordinated media manipulation campaigns, giving me a unique perspective on how the amplification sausage is made. Namely, I know what I talked to the reporter about versus what ultimately ended up in their story. Before I jump into my analysis, I wanted to offer the following caveat. It can be extremely challenging to cultivate ethical editorial practices when reporters' hands are partially or fully tied from employing those practices. For example, when your newsroom is tethered to click-based advertising models and other forms of public measurability, when you must personally meet certain word or story criteria, certain word or story quotas, in order to feed yourself, or when the culture of your newsroom favors dominant voices, perspectives, and experiences over underrepresented voices, perspectives, and experiences. Individual reporters, even some individual editors, often don't get to make the kinds of ethical decisions they wish they could. As I explore in my Oxygen of Amplification report, there are a whole mountain range of reasons underpinning why this is, and how these limitations help facilitate the spread of polluted information, regardless of how good individual reporters' intentions might be. Those structural issues need addressing. Today, though, the focus is more immediate. What about the stories you report tomorrow? How can you protect yourself from being manipulated or from having your platform hijacked by bad actors? Here are a few foundational observations. First, by definition, journalists are part of the amplification chain. Most pressing for this conversation, mis and disinformation gets its biggest and most profound boost from mainstream news coverage. Similarly, individual bigots, manipulators, and abusers are able to exert the influence they do, not because of their own organic reach, but because of the influence afforded them by the amplification of others, namely reporters. This is something they know and actively exploit. As a result, when it comes to media manipulation, journalists aren't just part of the manipulator's game. Journalists are the trophy. Getting reporters to cover hoaxes, conspiracy theories, and all stripes of false and misleading information is the desired outcome by those who seek to sow chaos, promote extremist ideologies, and broadly undermine democratic participation. In these cases, journalists don't just cover the news, they help establish precedent. When particular manipulation efforts work, that is to say, achieve the objective of being covered by reporters, that is a very compelling reason for other media manipulators to employ the same strategies in the future. In short, what hoaxes and spectacles and hate and harassment campaigns you report on today will set in motion more stories just like it tomorrow. Minimizing the political impact of mis and disinformation online, and relatedly, de-incentivizing bad actors' bad actions is, of course, easier said than done. There's not a specific universal formula for striking exactly the right balance in every conceivable moment. Indeed, there are as many arguments for reporting on stories with polluted elements as there are for not reporting on those stories. The ambivalence of amplification is captured by the following sets of conflicting and equally compelling assertions. On the one hand, and apologies for wall of text, amplification of harmful, polluted, or false information increases the likelihood and raises the stakes of harassment. It increases the likelihood that similar disinformation and harassment tactics will be used in the future. It makes particular stories, communities, and bad actors bigger, more visible, more influential than they ever would have been otherwise. It makes it very difficult, if not impossible, not to benefit those looking to manipulate journalists. It risks normalizing and desensitizing people to harmful views. It risks lending credence to false narratives. It relinquishes control of the narrative to bad actors and bad information. It privileges certain kinds of personalities and information. And it flattens more complicated and contested conversations. On the other hand, not amplifying harmful, polluted, or false information allows for the possibility that worse information will take its place. It means that someone else, whether in your newsroom or in another newsroom, will get to the story first and maybe get it wrong. It risks missing an opportunity to educate the public. Not amplifying specific instances of abuse, harm, and manipulation in particular risks reducing these concepts to clinical abstraction. Not amplifying allows poisonous ideology to flourish and cedes cultural territory to bigots and manipulators. It can inadvertently contribute to the process of radicalization. And most importantly, it doesn't mean that the issue, whatever it might be, will go away. The remainder of this talk will forward a series of tips designed to preempt and more effectively navigate some of this ambivalence. These tips won't, in and of themselves, magically solve the overall problem of information pollution. The overall problem of information pollution is, as mentioned earlier, structural and much bigger even than the global institution of journalism. Relatedly, these tips certainly won't extinguish the fires of violent extremism, but they can help newsrooms cultivate strategies for reporting on necessary information while minimizing manipulators' ability to hijack and weaponize that information. So the first point, beware the King Midas effect. According to Greek mythology, King Midas was blessed with the ability to turn everything he touched into gold. Well, blessed and also cursed, it doesn't take much imagination to appreciate the isolating interpersonal consequences of such a gift. The second King Midas touched them, any person or living creature he loved would be rendered inanimate. How, for example, could he be friends with a dog? In the context of news reporting, the King Midas effect points to the fact that the second you report on something, it becomes stabilized, search indexed, frozen in time, including mis- and disinformation. What otherwise would have been ephemeral becomes solid and enduring and primed to be amplified by others. It is therefore critical not to force the news. If a false narrative or dehumanizing meme or absurd conspiracy theory hasn't reached the tipping point, and that concept comes from there, that is to say, if something isn't relevant to anyone outside the community that created it, then it should not be reported. All reporting will do is ensure that the story will spread and will become relevant to those outside the community. Additionally and relatedly, it's critical to exercise strategic silence, which there's the source for that. When confronted with white supremacist hate or other actions that seek to terrorize and dehumanize, this doesn't necessarily mean not reporting on certain stories, although it can and sometimes should, especially when the tipping point criterion hasn't been met. Strategic silence is also an approach to framing the stories you do tell. Certain information, like the specific lines of attack against bigots use against marginalized groups, isn't itself necessarily newsworthy. Their words quoted verbatim don't add anything to the story except to parrot dehumanizing messages. In many cases, these details simply do not need to be included in order to tell the story. Now, the standard rejoinder to this point is that light disinfects. The idea that we have to call attention to what extremists are doing and saying in order to fight back. Not to do so risks signaling complicity with obvious historical examples serving as ultimate warning. I concede that point and offer a simultaneous reminder specific to the digital media landscape. Light might disinfect for some, but it also illuminates for others. Calling attention to violent bigotries in order to condemn those bigotries might be exactly what certain audiences need. For other audiences, however, calling attention to violent bigotries is exactly what they want. Violent bigotries splashed across newspaper headlines is a recruitment strategy and overarching approach to radicalization. It is also, in many cases, a point of delight, pride, and even hilarity for those who actively seek to manipulate the media. Getting their names and quotes in lights is the object of the game, with, again, reporters as the trophy. The question to ask is therefore, what audiences will your story reach, both intended and unintended? Is clarifying or condemning a point for one audience worth emboldening or otherwise rewarding another audience? To that point, consider what weapons you might be handing to your audience. As much as we all might like to be, no one in this room is a neutral conveyor of information, someone who never has to think about the facts we communicate after we have communicated them. In the fully globalized digital media landscape, audiences don't just digest the news they are given. They make things with the news they are given. They make memes out of your stories. They make counter-narratives out of your stories. They make enemies out of your stories. This point is particularly important in stories that focus on hate and harassment campaigns. Your newsroom may be seeking to call attention to harassment in order to condemn it. However, by including the social media profiles of victims, even if the victims are public figures, by including any identifiable information at all, you risk helping direct even more hate and harassment right to that person's doorstep. As individuals, you are not, of course, personally responsible for what readers do with the information you report. You cannot control that. What you can control is the amount of information they are able to transform into weapons. The tip is to minimize it. Speaking of the kind of information you report, when it comes to fact-checking efforts, remember that facts aren't cure-alls. First of all, and most basically, facts and facts alone are not why people believe in and do things. As an example, think about all of the things you have ever believed in strongly or done with great conviction. Was it because someone handed you a fact sheet with clearly labeled charts and graphs? Maybe, but maybe not. In many more cases than you probably realize, if you honestly asked yourself, you wouldn't be able to point to specific peer-reviewed empirical data as to why you love X or hate Y, or did P but not Q. When you believe in something strongly, when you act with gusto, you've often arrived at that point because the belief or action already coheres within a broader paradigm out of which your sense of reality emerges. If you were presented with information challenging that belief or condemning that action, you'd be likely to reject it out of hand or not even hear the person speaking. This point aligns with emerging research into the limitations of traditional media literacy strategies. Here are some citations. Particularly, the impulse within journalism to counter false and misleading information with objectively true claims. To fact check, in other words, often framed as the ultimate cure for what ails us. The problem is, first, that efforts to correct untruths often backfire, and instead of changing someone's mind, serve to entrench whatever false belief. Second, correcting an untruth doesn't undo mistrust of mainstream institutions. In fact, when a correction comes from an institution already regarded as biased, the debunk tends to fuel conspiratorial thinking. So the fake news is corrupt and desperate to force their own agenda. Therefore, if they say this story is false, it has to be true. Case closed. Regarding conspiracy theories in particular, debunks and explainers are most informative, appreciated, and generally beneficial to audiences who already know, or at least who are open to the possibility that something isn't true. In other words, to the audiences who need the debunkings the least. For those who already do believe, there is a real risk that debunks and explainers will only make the belief more entrenched, and therefore the overall problem of information disorder worse. So what do you do when you have to report on false, misleading, or otherwise manipulative narratives? Minimize focus on intentions and origins, and maximize focus on impact and context. When someone says or does something terrible on the internet, which is constantly, there is an ever-present impulse to assess that person's motivations. Was an aggressor really posting violently racist attacks because he actually hates Jewish people, for example? Or was he doing it ironically as trolling? Ask me about those scare quotes later. My contention is it doesn't matter. For one thing, it is often impossible to know for sure why people do things on the internet. It is often impossible to know if someone was speaking satirically or sincerely. Focusing on intent takes away from the broader issues a person's harmful statements raise. The ultimate question is not, in other words, if someone meant to convey violently racist sentiment. The ultimate question is instead, what message has this person communicated? What attitude does this communication normalize? And what impact does this communication have on the people forced to hear it? Similarly, while tracing the origins of a particular polluted text or meme or narrative can help establish context, it is critical not to restrict one's focus solely to where something came from, say, from a specific coordinated disinformation campaign. Something may have started as coordinated disinformation, but what makes coordinated disinformation so powerful is not the disinformation itself or even the coordination. It's the everyday people who authentically engage with it. That something hateful or false resonates, that it spreads across and between online communities, that it is able to thrive regardless of where the story originated or why it was originally shared, that's the story. That's the public health takeaway, and that's the thing to get to the bottom of. This point fits into the broader reminder to don't do public relations work for abusers, bigots, and manipulators. The first point of action to avoid is framing bad actors as the protagonists of the story, as if they were the anti-hero center around which the rest of the world evolves. They're part of the story, certainly, but more so are the people targeted and harmed by them. More so are the longer-term consequences of bad actors' behavior. Stories that focus solely on the bad actors, particularly stories that hand the bad actors a microphone and give them all the column space they need to tell their side of the story, only serve to reinforce the narrative that it's the bad actors' world and we're just living in it. These stories, as I mentioned earlier, also incentivize future bad action because front-page, first-person coverage is exactly the sort of coverage they want. Don't give them what they want. Give the public the information it needs to fully grasp what's at stake for those affected by the bad actors. This also means refusing to employ a euphemistic framing of their behavior. Most notably, do not call bad actors trolls. For one thing, that gives them the immediate out of screaming, "I was just trolling," the second they face consequences for their actions. Describe their actions instead in terms of the impact it has. So regardless of whether someone thinks they're being ironic or being cute or a troll or whatever helps them sleep at night, if their behavior communicates a violently misogynist message, describe it as violent misogyny. If they don't want their actions described as violently misogynist, well then, they should stop behaving in violently misogynist ways. Not doing PR for abusers, bigots, and manipulators also means familiarizing yourself with the playbook of media manipulation, introduced by Dana Boyd, and then not falling for these well-worn traps. Most notably are manipulators' efforts, first, to generate news coverage through social media spectacle, second, to frame the spectacle using new phrases that audiences will feel compelled to search for on Google, with the results ideally creating room for doubt or at least confusion. And third, to position themselves as digital martyrs in order to radicalize others. So the argument would go, see, journalists are so stupid, they're so biased, they're taking our irony seriously, and or they're trying to censor conservatives, which is a big problem in the US, and or, not that censoring conservatives is a problem, but that arguments that the news media does censor conservatives is a narrative that is very common in the US. Or, simply, that the news media is trying to feed you lies. That's the goal of the media manipulation playbook. Echoing this particular line of gaslighting, because all of that is gaslighting, trust no one. Understand that everything bigots, manipulators, and abusers say is or could be a trap, part of an overall effort to befuddle, enrage, or radicalize the public, and to pollute the information landscape so thoroughly that informed democratic participation becomes impossible. These efforts, as mentioned earlier, are achieved through triggering mainstream news coverage and, by extension, through the cacophonous social media commentary this coverage engenders. Manipulators need reporters, and in fact, they need everyday citizens as well, to signal boost their messages. This is what makes not signal boosting their messages so important. To this point, beware of source hacking, which are efforts to seed false information with smaller outlets that typically have a lower bar of editorial oversight, in the hope that this information will be cited by larger outlets, thereby becoming fact through repetition. Be aware that manipulators are aware of reporters' microphones. Treat with great suspicion anything posted to any hotbed of manipulative activity, whether it's 4chan or any other site known to be frequented by bad actors. They know you are watching them. They are likely talking right now about wanting you to watch them, though you are unlikely to see those meta-conversations which take place off-site, somewhere private, somewhere you can't easily find. There will be lots you don't know, even as you think you're looking at evidence of something fairly straightforward. Assume that anything you see on these sites is something they want you to see. And ask yourself, why might they want me to see this? What narrative might they be trying to tell? How might they be trying to take advantage of me and of my newsroom? In response to so much jockeying for influence, so much opportunity for subterfuge, you must go meta. And this is the last point. As I said earlier, there is no way of getting all of this right all of the time. But you can try, and you can talk about how you're trying and why you're trying in your reporting. For one thing, such an approach serves as a built-in defense against the dark arts. If you provide full context in your story, including editorial context, so why a story is structured in certain ways and how it fits into broader amplification issues and what's at stake for people targeted and for the wider public, it is more difficult to decontextualize and therefore more difficult to weaponize. Stories that signal awareness of media manipulation strategies are simply less of a trophy to media manipulators, because the underlying message of those stories is, I see you and understand what you're doing and will be reframing the narrative, rather than responding with a wide-eyed how high when asked by manipulators to jump. This might be more difficult in straight news reporting, but even then, reporters can, at the very least, clearly indicate what is not known about a story. For example, how many people are actually participating versus how many profiles appear to be participating, or who actually started the controversy, or the relative level of sincerity of participants. And most importantly of all, if we know for sure whether the story is part of a coordinated media manipulation campaign. Not knowing that, not knowing that information, and therefore not knowing how seriously to take a particular story, or what should be done about that particular story, is a basic frame readers need in order to understand the story. Not knowing what we don't know is critical. The goal in all of this isn't just to minimize the spread of polluted information. That is important, of course. But also important is modeling ethical self-reflection in readers so that they can apply a similar calculus in their own choices, to retweet or not retweet, to comment or not comment, to like or not like. The place to start is to foreground the question, to ask it again and again until it is a knee-jerk response. Exactly who might my amplification benefit, and exactly who might my amplification harm? Thank you. I go sit now, I think. Do you want to sit there?
I think so.
Sure.
Well, thank you very much for giving us so much to think about. I think I'm not the only one in the room who had to furiously note down questions and ideas while you were speaking. And I would like to start by connecting what you were saying a little bit with some of the remarks that were made before by Jakob Augstein and Carsten Brosta, which you couldn't understand, but where interestingly, interestingly, we had a conversation just upstairs before the event started, where we arrived at the surprising conclusion for three academics having a conversation there that capitalism is to blame for these issues on a very high sort of meta levels for providing some of the wrong incentives, perhaps, to some of the actors which are involved in the ecosystem that you described. And so that was exactly something that Carsten Brosta and Jakob Augstein also alluded to in different ways. But I want to get us started with a question that connects to the title of this event, and which ties in, I think, perfectly with your talk, namely, given what you just told us, do we need to reclaim public discourse at all? That's the title of this event, and if I understand correctly what you were just saying, one could argue that public discourse is actually not what all of this or much of this stuff that is happening online, or that is planted online, that is spread to then be picked up by journalists. Mm-hmm. If that is not public opinion, then isn't an event where you say we need to reclaim public discourse from the people who are now occupying it, sort of maybe, you know, is that the wrong framing? Aren't we talking up the ability of extremists to shape public discourse? Are they representative of the public opinion?
I mean, well, it depends on what public and what opinion. But, I mean, I do think that there is an outsized influence that they're able to wield, and that certainly is true in the United States. Their numbers are comparatively small, and they don't represent the majority of the American opinion, but they do represent an outsized level of influence in what gets covered. So the people whose stories are covered are theirs. The people who are handed microphones are them. You don't see in the United States people handing microphones to the groups impacted by manipulation campaigns and racist activities. They don't get to speak on the platform. So it is true that their numbers are limited. It's true that their organic influence is limited. And it would be restricted to a fairly small ecosystem, sort of the far right ecosystem, if it weren't for the signal boosting power of center-left sort of mainstream media in the US. So they don't actually wield all of the power in reality, but in effect, they do claim a lot of cultural space, and there are many opportunities to intervene in that influence. It doesn't have to be that way. And there has been in the US more of a recognition that we don't have to be stuck on the same conversations. We don't have to continue placing the bad actors at the center of the narrative. We can do something different. And that was sort of a slow realization in the US, unfortunately, but I do think that talking about reclaiming the public sphere to actually reflect the public. The public is not extremist. The public tends to not be, that far in one direction or the other. So why is it that all of the media representation suggests that extremism is, in fact, more mainstream than it is?
Right. And is that, you were saying upstairs that this is, you called it two-sidism, I think, that the idea that there are two sides to every story, and I was reminded of this adage that's also been going around social media about if one source says it's raining and the other says it's dry, your job is to look out of the window, which makes it sound all very simple, which it isn't. But is that something, that's certainly something you encounter in all sorts of national discourses, but how specific is this to the US in your mind and to the idea that there are binary politics of left and right and there's nothing between that?
In the United States, we have a bit of an obsession with the First Amendment. I like it. I think it's great, but it often is used as kind of a silencing mechanism. So with reporting in America, you get accused of censorship if you are not including both sides of the story. So if some person says, white supremacy isn't good, then the impulse in the United States is to go to a white supremacist and say, well, here's a microphone, can I get your side of the story? And what that does is it elevates unequal positions as if they were equal and risks at least positing extremist views as being more mainstream because they're taken as seriously, they're given as much weight, in some cases more weight because American journalists tend to overcompensate for fear of being accused of being having anti-conservative bias, so they give more microphones to more conservative people in the fear that they're going to be accused of bias, which they will be anyway. And so there is a particular knee-jerk response that happens in the US based on how fearful, not just journalists, but one of the fastest ways to shut down a conversation with an American, just as an FYI, in case you're ever at a party, just tell them they hate the Constitution. So if you just accuse an American of hating the Constitution, they'll immediately quiet, because that is anathema to, for many people, a sort of sense of national identity. So that gets weaponized. As much as I like the Constitution, it's a really effective strategy for helping launder damaging information into the mainstream, because if you don't do it, then that means you hate the Constitution, you're un-American, and you're biased, and you're fake news. And that is just something that American reporters in particular, and American citizens in general, we don't like accusations that we're censoring people. So it's a really good trick of getting certain things to be reported. And that is, I think, particular to the United States because of our legal structures, but both sidesism is, it's a thing that happens outside the US too, but I do think that, you need to talk about our relationship to our founding documents.
I think it's something that happens everywhere, or that definitely comes up a lot here as well in Germany. But interestingly, sort of the different priorities that the Constitution assigns to certain values here, and ranking things like not leading hateful public discourse, and prioritizing that makes the argument for you're against the constitutional values kind of ring very hollow. But let's just for a second, and then we'll get back, or I would like to ask some more questions about journalism. But for a moment, let's talk about if we take arguments about the suppression of speech seriously, and they're very often used as strawman arguments, which are just ridiculous, but let's assume there is this potential danger of silencing legitimate speech, and this ties into how, for example, big social media platforms handle political discourse. In Germany, very often regulation and deleting and suppressing and blocking certain types of hateful discourse is often framed as a cure-all. Where do you see the limits of this approach? Or when you said sunlight is not the solution, it seems to be shining a light on problematic things, but where do you see potential risks of using non-visibility, of using suppression in these discourses?
Yeah, one a very interesting thing that I came to understand as I did. So when I did the Oxygen of Amplification report, I spoke to 50 reporters, and some of them, I think 20% of them, were not working in the United States. They're working elsewhere, but the majority of them were working in the US because it was focused on the 2016 election, in particular ours. And one of the things that came up in doing that work is a lot of journalists' concern about what happens if you take someone's microphone away. That on one hand, you know, there's a movement in the US, a deplatforming movement. So we don't want white supremacists to be on social media. We don't want them to be able to host their websites, that there's often sort of boycott campaigns, that if a certain, you know, web server is hosting content that's dehumanizing in this way, there's pressure, well, let's take them off the web. Let's take away their place to convene. And, you know, there are compelling arguments as to why that's an important thing to do. You take away their microphone and then they can't say terrible things. Great. However, when you do that, they don't go away. That energy doesn't dissipate. Typically what happens is that the energy goes further underground, that they go to spaces that are less regulated, that are, so the difference between if you delete or if you ban someone from Twitter, you know, then they are likely to migrate over to Gab, which is the far right sort of, not equivalent, but it's kind of a Twitter in its own way. And that space is even more pro-free speech in the funny way that it gets used in the United States. And so then people find themselves in an even more extremist echo chamber. So they've been denied a platform in a more mainstream circumstance. They've lost the ability to have their views in any way challenged, whether or not, you know, outside views could ever penetrate their worldview is a question to begin with. But if you remove them from those spaces, then there's no opportunity that their minds could be changed. They're more likely to become more radicalized because they've now been essentially banished from mainstream society. So I am in favor of my attitude towards free speech, I believe in a robust kind of free speech. In order to have a robust public sphere, there needs to be sincere, genuine, democratic participation, the most speech for the most number of people. In order to make that happen, you sometimes have to silence the most violent people so that more people can talk, a more robust approach to free speech. So I believe in that strongly. You know, but it raises these other complicated questions of, okay, you cordon them off, but then what are they going to do? They're not going to become less extreme over time. They'll become more extreme over time, and then you can't see what they're doing. So when I mentioned during the talk, you know, you go to 4chan or you go to whatever space where manipulators dwell, and you can see what's publicly facing. But whatever is publicly facing, just assume that there's 100 times more discourse happening privately. You can't see that. You can't see what they're coordinating. You don't know what they're talking about. You can't anticipate the threat. There is no threat model that you can run because you don't know what you don't know. And that's true about the deplatforming push. Even if it has some validity, and I think that it can be helpful and important, it also creates its own complications at the same time.
Since this is a room full of journalists, can I get back to the question of strategic silence, employing strategic silence as a journalist without violating journalistic norms, or perhaps whether we need some sort of dynamics or changes in journalistic norms, so that doesn't the public have a right to know about X, Y, and Z, which you were talking about, and to what extent is this a problem or an issue of journalistic norms, and to what extent is it an economic issue that has something to do with the economic incentives of covering certain issues? And I say this sort of with a broad range of journalistic quality or non-quality in mind that exist.
Well, I think that journalistic norms, they're great. And they sometimes run into trouble in a digital media landscape. Journalistic norms did not come into being in the era of Facebook. And part of the problem of providing all of the facts, every conceivable fact, is that those facts are so easily weaponized in a digital environment. So, you know, being able to tell the full story of someone who's been harassed, for example, that is something the public needs to, I mean, there are things that the public needs to know, but the information you give them can be immediately turned into weapons by people who want to sow even more chaos. So it's not that journalists shouldn't do their job, and I'm certainly not arguing that stories shouldn't be reported. For one thing, that's logistically a problematic even idea, because if you're not reporting on it, there's still going to be, people are still going to be talking about it on Facebook. They have their own platforms. They have their own media ecosystem. The story will spread, and you just won't have any control over it. You won't be able to make any effort to frame it. So not reporting is often not an option, but there are certain stories that are simply not necessary. So in the United States, one of the things that happened so frequently post 2016 election in particular, and even right after the Charlottesville white supremacist march, is that you would have outlets like the New York Times writing articles that were just pointing at people who self-identified as being white supremacist. And the articles just argued, this person exists. This is a person, and he identifies as a neo-Nazi, and he shops at Target, and he likes to eat pineapple, and he loves his wife, and he has a good relationship with his mom. And that was the totality of the story. And so while the rise of far right extremism, the impact that extremism has on communities of color and a whole range of folks, you know, those issues are important and are critical for the public to know, but it's not critical for the public to know that this one guy likes fruit. That's just not, so it's not so much what gets reported as it is how it gets reported. So even if you wanted to say, don't ever write stories about white supremacists, they're gonna write their own stories. So they're part of the discourse. There's nothing that anyone can do about that. But what do you choose to highlight? And are you making them the center of your story? I mean, so what was really remarkable in the US there was a generic term. This was such a frequent kind of story in the US that it had its own genre. And one of the things that genre never did, ever did any reporters ever interview any of the, for example, black people who lived in those individuals' neighborhood. They never asked what the impact of these ideologies were. It was handing a microphone to the supremacist, and that was the entire story. It wasn't, what's it gonna be like now for his neighbors, now that his neighbors know that he's been outed by the New York Times as being an avowed and enthusiastic white supremacist. So you can tell that same story, but from a different angle if you're talking to the people who are affected. So strategic silence like I said, sometimes it's spiking a story, but more often than not, it's just how are you approaching that story? Who are you telling that story for? And who is the story ultimately going to benefit? Right.
One of the caveats being that, I was just thinking about the situation here, that of course if you have elected officials from a Democratic party or notionally Democratic party, it's very hard not making them the center of attention of a story probably. But moving away from the focus for a moment on sort of grassroots or we talked about subcultural trolling in the very beginning. You mentioned this also. What about sort of a contrast, thinking of something like the European elections, to organized disinformation campaigns run by state actors which deliberately plant information, fabricate information to manipulate public opinion? Do the insights that you've shared with us sort of extend to or map onto those kinds of scenarios as well, of propaganda in the more traditional sense?
I mean, one of the things that makes coordinated, especially state-sponsored disinformation campaigns so tricky is that many of those campaigns, especially what we're learning more and more about the Russian government's activities, is that a lot of these behaviors are pulling from the playbook of early subcultural trolling. The thing that I studied in 2008, you had this group of individuals who were part of a subculture, and it's not important to know the specifics of it, but the people who were participating were honing very, very specific and ultimately very, very effective media manipulation strategies. So the specific participants may have changed over time, the desired outcomes may have changed over time, but the rhetorical strategies have been being perfected essentially for 10 years. And so when you look at what the Internet Research Agency was doing, they were engaging in practices that were popularized and honed in the US, in these subcultural corners of the internet in 2008. These are strategies that have proven themselves to be so incredibly effective that, coordinated campaigns are taking from a trolling playbook, but on a much broader scale and with much broader aims. It's not just so subcultural trolls, they wanted to mess with reporters and just thought it would be funny to get gross and offensive stories published in a newspaper. So their motivations were often pretty puerile and tee-hee, let's get the journalist to say something weird and gross and then we'll all laugh amongst ourselves. Not that that makes it okay. And a lot of those behaviors were racist and sexist and homophobic and all of these kinds of things, but the scale was typically smaller, and those same strategies have just been adopted on a national and even global scale. And the fact that they're 10 years old, at least, they have 10 years of perfecting over time. It is really easy to get reporters to jump. They know what buttons to push. And so you have state organizations doing those things because they've been so effective for so long.
So do read Whitney's book for an account of how this sort of started.
If you want to, you don't have to.
The example that still is in my mind very much is a really disgusting one that I'm not going to discuss.
That was what I was thinking too, but I didn't want to.
So
we spared you all. You're welcome.
Yeah. So let's open it up. I've had you to myself for such a long time. Questions? There's a question in the back. If you move forward a little bit, there's a microphone.
Thank you so much for your talk. And one of the things I was thinking about while you were talking is one of the presumptions or premises you have is that there needs to be some sense of responsibility as a journalist. And I think this is where the problem starts, because I think maybe not for people who are here, because obviously they're interested in this, but generally when I look at how reporting is being done, and one case that I would like to point out is a German one, I think 2 years ago, when the leader of the AfD, a right-wing party in Germany, was saying that one of the national football players, that people wouldn't want him as a neighbor. And that statement was then taken as a task to talk about whether black people can be good neighbors or not. And then his neighbors were being asked if he's a good neighbor. And a whole debate started about whether black people can be good neighbors or not. And, and this is not just one case, repetitively has been happening over the course of about 10 years. And one of the things I was asking myself is that the responsibility and the power that comes with being a journalist, do people take into account that this is a powerful job that they have and that there's a responsibility within that? And then secondly, I was asking myself if, some of the examples you were saying, the presumption there is, or the premise is that people know what racism is, that they know what sexism is, that they know what anti-Semitism is. And personally, when I examine how reporting is being done, I feel that there's a lack of knowledge there and lack of self-criticism. And then I was also asking myself if there needs maybe a general discourse about the ethos and the ethics of being a journalist, and if maybe this is where we should take on and maybe think about these values and effects we have.
Yeah, thank you. So both of those points are related, and I'll speak to the second one first. I think that a lot of these conversations, particularly in an American context, so much of the problems of this kind of reporting has to do with diversity and representation in newsrooms. And when you have a newsroom that's not particularly diverse, and especially is populated primarily by white men, no offense to white men, but there might be elements of a story that don't occur to those reporters. Every single person as an individual is going to have some areas where they're not, either have some blind spots or some questions that it wouldn't occur to them to ask because they've not had those embodied experiences. In the US, many of the reporters who covered the alt-right beat, for one thing, they were mostly white dudes because those were the least likely people to be attacked at white supremacist rallies. So they had access in a way that women wouldn't or people of color wouldn't. So there was some safety and logistic reasons why the coverage was so skewed. But then also it was the fact that newsrooms were primarily white and primarily male. And when they were presented with those kinds of stories, the first question tended not to be, what is the embodied impact of racism and sexism? What does it feel like to be physically threatened? The question was more of an abstract idea about the limits of free speech, or white supremacy as a concept, and especially for younger reporters who don't have really an embodied historical understanding of what the stakes in these conversations are. It's very easy to approach these conversations in an abstract kind of, way where, yeah, you're talking about the issue and you probably don't like white supremacists, but you're not personally threatened. And if there were more people who had an embodied understanding of what that concept is, then potentially you would have different kinds of reporting. So that's one of the structural issues that I mentioned, or that I referred to at the beginning, is diversity and representation. And that's something, in my experience in the US working with reporters there, that more and more of the white reporters that I spoke to and worked with became more aware of the things that they missed. So in one instance, a woman who had been covering internet culture stuff, and particularly trolling and 4chan, she had been seeing swastikas everywhere in this one online gaming environment that she was covering. But she had no reason, the swastikas didn't mean anything to her. It was an abstract idea. It was just a visual that indicated that someone was kidding. So she took it that this was all just joking. This is just playing on just the internet, and it was fine. And it was because she didn't have a relationship to that symbol and didn't know to take it seriously. And so many people were suddenly, many of the white reporters I worked with were, and reporters who were not Jewish or who weren't practicing in any way, they realized after Charlottesville in particular, oh, we missed some things because of our subject positions, because of our identities. But broadly, not just related to issues of diversity and representation, in the US, many of the reporters I worked with, I've been making this argument for 10 years, and for the first 5 years that I was making the argument, reporters would get mad at me or would agree and be sympathetic, but ultimately they couldn't include any of this in their stories because their editors, they couldn't go meta, they couldn't talk about it. But as 2015 yielded what 2015 yielded, and 2016 happened, and then Charlottesville happened, all of these things, as these things happened, more and more of the reporters that I spoke to started to talk more and more about their sense of a feeling that they were worried about amplification, that they felt responsible in a way that had never been part of our conversations before. So in the US, in my experience, there was a shift in the ethos. How do we as reporters think about the work that we do? And maybe a sense before, with the people that I worked with, was that they got to just report on stories and then walk away from them. And that they were just delivering the news and they weren't part of the stories, and the view from nowhere kind of the thing. And fewer people in the US are ascribing to that model. So there has definitely been a shift that I have observed. But then it also, like I said, it tethers to these questions of who's in the newsroom and how do those bodies impact what gets reported or what doesn't.
Further questions? We have time for 2 short ones or 1 longer one.
I'm Stefan Rusmol from the European Journalism Observatory. I would like to come back to your last suggestion, go meta. And I think the US media, particularly the New York Times and the Washington Post, do a much better job here than most of the German media in covering journalism, in explaining journalism, in by doing so also helping audiences to understand better how professional journalism works. Nevertheless, the Washington Post and the New York Times have abolished the institution of ombudsmen, and these ombudsmen, particularly of these 2 newspapers, really did a marvelous job in explaining journalism, in making journalism more credible. Could you comment a little bit on this? Why did this happen? And we are here in a very specific place because something very similar to the Jason Blair scandal happened right in this house. So the natural reaction, I think, would be how the New York Times reacted years ago, creating the position of a reader's representative who explains what goes wrong in journalism to the audiences, but nothing like this has happened so far.
Yeah, it's tricky. I mean, so one of the arguments that I've heard many reporters make, sort of off the record, is that they're worried about, they agree that they want to sort of call attention to journalism practices. They want to illustrate to readers how stories get made, and then if readers know how stories get made, that could lend, more credibility to the overall institution. But some of the worry is that if a journalist does that, if a journalist does acknowledge, or if a whole paper, if a New York Times or a Washington Post, if they spend too much time advertising the ways that maybe they've gotten something wrong, that might reinforce the sort of fake news idea, that might further erode mistrust in institutions, which are in the US is at an all-time high. So there's a tension between wanting to show readers what, and I think that maybe this was part of the issue at the Times, wanting to show readers what goes on, but also wanting to keep some of the inner workings more proprietary, because extremists will descend upon those failings or the machinery and say, see, you shouldn't trust them because they get things wrong sometimes, because they have to issue corrections sometimes. This is how journalism works, and it's imperfect, and therefore you shouldn't believe any of it. So I think that there's a tension that has to be navigated, certainly in the US, and which is why the suggestion to go meta is a tricky one for that reason. We want to be critical of the institution so that the institution can be better. But we don't want to be too critical, because that will fuel the fire for why so many people mistrust how the news gets made. So there's no perfect solutions to any of this. But I do think that being a little bit more self-reflective about it, and at least acknowledging amplification chains, is a good place to start. But again, I wish that I had solutions. I just have a lot of worries to share. Many, many worries.
You leave us in a dilemma, but thankfully we have 1.5 days to ponder these problematic issues. Thank you very much,
Thank you.
Whitney. And we now adjourn for the coffee break. Thanks.
Thanks.